Bob, welcome to the Church of Christ at Belen, and we appreciate you bringing your museum. What did you want to show us today?
Well, Chuck, on this table we have artifacts that are evidences from the global flood. And I've got two acquisitions here that I've gotten this year. And these are little animals. This is a crouching rabbit, and this is a bovine. And these are found throughout Mesopotamia. And when they find them in pairs, and they were strung. They have little holes in the top. They're strung and worn around the neck, and they're in pairs. Two rabbits, every type of animal you can imagine are found. And people were petrified of another global flood. And
Obviously.
yeah, and you know the stories are more, I believe, legends. There's probably elements of truth mixed in with a little bit more fantasy.
Mm-hmm.
But here we have Gilgamesh, and this is from a large relief that was found on the side of a carving there. And then the Epic of Gilgamesh, and that is the story of Gilgamesh seeking out the Noah character who survives the flood and asking him, how did you survive the flood? Now, he tells him he did it in the ark, but the dimensions are different than that in the Bible. And it's not an ocean-going measurement. It's 120 by 120 by 120 cubits. So why might that be? Well, there is the Tower of Babel. There's a language barrier. Theophilus G. Pinchas was an Assyriologist, did a lot of translating and died in the early 1900s. He says that Gilgamesh is Nimrod in the Bible. And the Bible says that Nimrod is the first king of Akkad and Erech and these ancient civilizations.
Mm-hmm.
But the Assyrians say that Gilgamesh is. So when Gilgamesh died, the Assyrians deify him as Merodach, which means rebellion in Assyrian.
Oh, wow.
And Nimrod in Hebrew means rebellion. And so Theophilus Pinchas does a lot of that, looking at that etymology in his books and showing that these characters were actually real people. And then over here we have cylinders.
Just a question. So Nimrod is the great-grandson of Noah then, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, thereabouts, yeah. And so he is a direct descendant of Ham.
Oh, okay.
And so here we've got cylinder seal impressions, and you can see here a serpent that is being ridden, and there's another one here that is a little more detailed, but it doesn't show up well on camera. And so you have the different characters, but the serpent's name is Tiamat, and that means chaos, and he is blamed for the root cause of the flood. And some of these have writings on them, and this one in particular says that on the land fell a calamity, one unknown to man, one that had never been seen before, one which could not be withstood, a great storm from heaven, a land annihilating storm.
Wow.
And what that tells us is these are like their signatures. And so people carry these cylinder seals around their neck. They're like the shape of a finger. They make the story. But so many have references to the global flood. And to them, it was not a regional flood. It was a global flood. And these are found at all different elevations throughout the Middle East.
So this is in essence a secular proof of the biblical flood that is recorded in Genesis.
Definitely.
Okay.
This lower timeline is based using scripture. So on the left side of the flood is using Genesis chapter 5, and it gives the age when their first son was born, except for Adam, who was on day 6, and it gives the age that they die. And so that gives us a visual, and we see that Methuselah dies the year of the flood. Now, it doesn't say he dies in the flood, but he dies the year of the flood. Noah, we see, crosses over and lives 350 years after the flood, 600 years before the flood. And then we pick up the rest of the timeline in Genesis chapter 11, verses 10 through 24. And we see that Abraham is around 67 years of age when Noah dies. In the ancient text, the Noah character is seen as someone that is eternal, that he is, because he's outliving generations of people.
Right.
And so it makes sense. Why does Abraham not have some type of verbal relations with Noah? There's a lot of time passes, the Tower of Babel, and I think that changing that language just really threw a wrench in a lot of things that were passed down over the flood, and then they kind of get disseminated with a little twist. So you have history, but because of the language barrier, I believe a lot of the history gets somewhat twisted, so it's not always exactly like the biblical account, but there's a lot of parallels. And I think that's why you see a lot of that in the ancient text.
So this is something that you're going to address more in detail in the lecture coming this Monday?
Yes.
Okay. And then what is the top chart about? What is the basis behind it?
There's just different quotes that I have up there. Josephus said that the ark was visible in 94 AD in his day, and it was on the southeast side of Turkey, or the Mount Ararat, not on the Turkey side, but on the Iraqi side. All of the ancient flood stories put the ark landing on the southeast side. Irving Finkel, British curator, says, I don't know why they're all looking on the west side of Mount Ararat, because all of the ancient documents point to the southeast side of Ararat. I'll tell you why they look there, because they need to get money, they need to find something. It's the only place they can get permits, and then it's safe to go searching for the ark. You try to do it on the southeast corner, it's very dangerous, and you just can't go looking for these things. And whether there's any remnants there that are still there today, we don't know.
Well, it's wood, so.
So the Liberty ship means what?
The Liberty ship is, this, in World War II, they needed to get cargo to, for D-Day invasion into Europe and into the Pacific. The British had a design, and it is the ratio of Noah's Ark. It's almost the same length, it's the same height, and it is a little more narrow than Noah's Ark, just by 10, 12 feet. These things were, they could hold a lot of weight, they could hold a lot of goods, they could hold like 2,800 Jeeps, 440 tanks, and they were the backbone of getting the invasion forces where they needed them. None sank in high seas, but they did sink because of torpedoes and faulty welding. There were some losses because of that, because they were trying to build them too fast with people who were not trained. That, you know, they were trained very quickly, and so there were some errors. And it's just an amazing, in San Francisco, you have the SS Jeremiah O'Brien, and you can go visit it and go through, and of course there's bigger ships today, but it's adequate to do what it had to have done, like the Noah's Ark vessel, to get those animals on the other side of the deluge.
Well, and the other question I have for you, and I know you got other stuff to show us, you know, popular belief is that the ark was what we would see an ark boat shape, but evidently, based on your design, it would be more like a barge.
Well, it only needs to be like a barge. I mean, he had no place to go, it's not gonna sail, so he didn't need to cut through that, and it only had one window and one door, and people seem to have trouble when they build a model of following Noah's guidelines that he got from God, that it has one window and one door. And so that kind of bothers me, but a barge shape would be sufficient, but whether it had a bow or these things, I don't know. God told Noah to build an ark. He tells Moses to build an ark of the covenant. So they are two different Hebrew words, but basically it's a box or a rectangle. So.
Thank you very much, Bob, for coming and sharing
You're
this
welcome.
with us.
Thank you. Over here I've got some Egyptian artifacts I'd like to show you. And one of the ones that we got this year are some mummy wrappings. And this was from a museum that went out of business in the 1980s and came up at auction.
Wow.
Here we have some Egyptian artifacts. This we got this year, and it's from a museum that went defunct in the 1980s.
Oh, wow.
And this came up at auction. And the lighter colored, you see here, is further away from the body. The darker ones got soaked with the oils used in the embalming process. In the 1990s, an Egyptologist named Bob Breyer and his colleague Ronald Wade did an embalming in Egypt. And the Egyptians never wrote it down, but there was the Greek historian Herodotus that went there and made some notes. They tried and they followed that, and they found it took 40 days to do the initial embalming. And then there was a law in Egypt that no body could be buried until the 70th day. And if you read Genesis chapter 50, verses 2 and 3, we see that Joseph had Jacob embalmed. It took 40 days for the embalming, and it was the 70th day that they bury him in the cave where Abraham is buried and Isaac. These are little beaded masks that the common people would have put upon their cartonnage when they were buried.
What are the
And
beads made out of?
Fiance. And it's a metal, but it's not a strong metal. It's more used for jewelry and those types of things. And so we have some of that.
Is that like a death necklace?
It would have been probably used in this manner, strapping this around there. So,
Okay.
and then here is a crude replica of the Ipwar papyrus, which is at the Royal Dutch Museum. And Ipwar, I-P-U-W-E-R, writes about the things that are happening to Egypt while he's alive, and it parallels the plagues of Egypt. And the river has turned to blood. There is no light in the land. It talks about the different diseases that the cattle have. It talks about a pillar of fire that is risen up on high against the enemies. And then the slaves have taken jewelry and gold from their masters, and it parallels the plagues and the Exodus there. When asked about this, the curator of the Royal Dutch Museum, in a documentary that Tim Mahoney did, says, yes, it's remarkably similar, but the dates are off, is what he says. So, but the parallels are uncanny.
The ship?
The ship?
This is called a punt ship. This is based on a relief in the tomb of Pharaoh Sahar, and S-A-H-U-R-E. And in the relief, you can see that it seems that the ship is held together by rope. And they did a documentary, PBS did something on one of these where they try to reconstruct one, and they're not real seaworthy. They can go in a straight line fine, but they feel that they had to probably row them back to Egypt. Okay, I'd like to talk to you now about the Canaanite god Baal, or Baal, B-A-A-L. This is a small, personal sized, that is an actual god that somebody had. And he typically carries a mallet to strike the clouds and a lightning bolt in his other hand. And then his consort is Ashtoreth, the Canaanite version of her. But these characters go throughout all cultures. And the Canaanites are descendants of Canaan, but they are Phoenicians to the Greeks. The Greeks gave them the name Phoenician. They had amazing ships. They took the cedars of Lebanon throughout all the Mediterranean world and even into Persia. And the Canaanites worshipped by sacrificing their children. They find these urns with ashes, and in these urns are ashes of children 18 months to 24 months to 3 years old. and they have been burned. Evidently, the archaeologists that are looking at this think that they've been burned in an oven. And they had settlements throughout all the ancient Mediterranean world: Carthage, Tyre, Sidon, Byblos, and Moitsa off the coast of Sicily. And so these are some of those artifacts. Ashtoreth is also Diana of the Ephesians, in the Latin Artemis to the Greeks. She's a goddess of fertility and also a warrior goddess. Thor is the Norse version of the Canaanite Baal, and he's still making movies today. And then DC Comics used this mythology to create the woman heroine, Wonder Woman. And so they're still around today in various forms and various things, but this here is a bronze ladle. This is a Roman ladle, and it was used for sacrifices, and these would be poured on directly to the sacrifice, and wine would be poured onto the sacrifice as an offering. Okay, here on this table we have artifacts, mostly Assyrian artifacts. These are always found in pairs. These particular ones, these are replicas of the ones that are 16 foot tall that were on either side of Sargon II's palace entrance. Other Assyrian kings did the same thing, but they put their face on these, and they're winged creatures. Some of them have hooves, and some of them have these types of claws. And if you compare that to Ezekiel chapter 1 and Ezekiel chapter 10, there's a lot of similarity to this in the cherubim that he describes there in those chapters. These, it was thought that anything that nothing could pass through that had evil heart, that these were able to see into the heart. When you look back to the Garden of Eden, you had cherubims that guarded the entrance into the garden. And we see the Assyrians doing this. Even the households had these little things like these at their doorways. But you see it in other cultures. You see it, China has similar things with dragons. The Persians have sphinx, they call them, or griffiths, and they look somewhat similar. And here you have the Taylor prism. There are 3 copies that Sennacherib had made that we've found to date. One's in Jerusalem, one is in Chicago at the Oriental Institute, and the main one is at the British Museum, and that's the one that was discovered first. And what it does, it talks about Sennacherib's coming into Judea and capturing 46 of the fortified cities, but his goal was to get to Jerusalem. But he only gets as close as Lachish, and he destroys Lachish, goes back home, puts that on his wall, but he never gets to Jerusalem, and that's parallels the biblical account in Isaiah chapter 36 through 39. On here, he says, I had Hezekiah like a bird in a cage in his royal city, Jerusalem. And that's as close as you'll get to an ancient king admitting defeat. So that's pretty amazing. And
is there writing on here?
yes, that's called cuneiform writing.
Okay.
And so the Assyrians had their own language in the cuneiform writing. The Persians had their own writing language in that style. The Babylonian language is somewhat different, but it's all cuneiform. And it's created from pictographs. So it's sort of like Egyptian hieroglyphics, but they end up simplifying it so they can make a language out of it so they can write and read it.
Okay.
Then this is interesting. This is called the Nabonidus cylinder, and there's always criticism that Belshazzar, in Daniel chapter 5, that Belshazzar
There you go.
had the feast, and that there's no record of Belshazzar ever being a king of Babylon. But he says that Daniel could be the 3rd ruler in the kingdom, which meant that he must be the 2nd. Nabonidus is his father. Nabonidus wrote this little prayer. He went up to Assyria, and he was repairing temples, and he wrote on here, may the god Asher watch over my son Belshazzar, whom I've left in charge in my absence. And so his name is there, and it fits the biblical account. And then the Cyrus cylinder, Jeremiah said there would be 70 years that they would be captive in Babylon. When Cyrus the Persian captures Babylon, on the 70th year he makes this edict and allows the Jews to go back to their homeland, but also all the other prisoners that the Babylonians had displaced. And so Cyrus the Persian allows them all to go back. And the original is at the British Museum there. And then one other thing I think is very important, and this is a replica of the Black Obelisk. And it is about 6.5 foot tall, and there are panels here that go around and they tell a story. And this is the king of Assyria, Shalmaneser III. And in this panel here, you have King Jehu, Jehu, of Israel, bowing down and bringing his tax or his tribute money to the king of Assyria. And then there's 4 other panels that go all the way around of other kings that come and bring their tribute. This is the only image of an Israelite that has been discovered. And so that's quite interesting. Okay, so I want to talk to you a little bit about some of the mannequins that we have. And these 2 here are Assyrian. They're from the movie Alexander. And this was a satrap costume. And a satrap was a governor. And in the book of Daniel, you see Daniel is in charge of 120 satraps. And so this was used in the movie Alexander, and one of the Bactrian governor satraps wore that costume. And then here we have a Persian archer and a shield. This was used in the movie Alexander, and it's based on a relief of Darius's palace that was there. And sometimes these are called immortals. There was always 1,000 of them. If one died, they replaced them, and that's why they were called immortals. We see that the Assyrians don't wear armor, but they have shields, bows and arrows, and swords, and this is what I got from that. Then over here, I pieced together from a couple of movies that used Egyptian styled attire. And so this is a replica sword that is an Egyptian style sword. And then the waist wrapping that goes around. And that was actually used probably in an Egyptian movie and a science fiction movie. And then this is based on the faience metal, sort of a breast type plate there. And so that gives you sort of a feel of an Egyptian soldier at the time. And they're a lot more lightly armored than others that you see. Then over here we have a Greek. This was from the movie Alexander. This is a bronze breastplate and backplate, and then the Macedonian style helmet. These soldiers carried sarissas. They were 16 foot long, and it's hard to travel place to place because the ceilings are so small, so I don't have one of those with me. And then these are simulated leather, and these were used in the movie Hercules with Dwayne Wade. And but this is a Greek style, and the way they fought, and when they went up against the Persians, and they were outnumbered probably 10 to 3 when they fought the Persians, and in both cases Alexander just made a beeline for the Persian king Darius, and he fled the battlefield both times. I want to show you now some pottery that I've collected over the years, and it's not a big collection, but I like some of the things that we have. This is an Egyptian alabaster cup, and we know that Mary had an alabaster, and some translations say box.
Is that one real, and how old is it?
It's real, and it dates to between probably 650 to 350 BC.
Wow.
And they're heavy, and if you hold it up to the sun, it's really kind of translucent. And Mary, it said, had an alabaster box that she had the oil that she poured over Jesus. But box just means container, so in the Greek. This is an Assyrian palm vase, and you see the palms there, and this is a reproduction. And then we have a Judean oil lamp, and it would have had the olive oil and the wick would have come out there. And then you have a Roman style, and this has Eros, the god there. Some people call it Cupid. Not a nice little guy, and worked the same way. These are real. These date to 200 to 100 AD. This is a small jar that would have been used for wine or spices or oils, and then a small bowl. Now, if you look at the Roman pottery here, it's much more simple in comparison till you get to the Greek pottery. The Greek potteries typically have the things that are in their mythology, and their mythology was their religion, and that's what they believed. And so these are very religious vessels for them. This was a drinking cup, but sometimes these are found with a hole in the mouth, and they're used at offerings, and the wine would be poured into this and poured directly onto the offering. And then this is Artemis, Diana of the Ephesians. She's also a warrior goddess. And so that's on here. And just to compare, if you compare the Greek pottery and think about the book of Luke is 30% longer by word count than any other of the Gospels. And then if you look at the book of Mark, it's the shortest. The book of Mark appeals to the Roman mind, and the book of Luke appeals to the Greek Hellenistic mind. And so you can see they had a different outlook, just even looking at their pottery, the way they viewed things. These are Persian arrows heads that I was able to acquire, and they were owned by Axel Gutmann, who was a famous collector. And this particular arrow has some white on it, and that's indicative of a flesh find, and so that it hit its target. And then these are river finds. And these are Persian arrowheads, and these are from a famous collector, Axel Gutmann, and I acquired these after his collection went up for auction. And this one has white spots on it, and that's indicative of a flesh find. And then this one has a bend. It was a river find. Both of Alexander's battles with the Persians were near rivers. And so this is a Greek arrowhead, a bronze arrowhead, and it also came from that same collection. This is something that came near the border of India with Afghanistan, and it shows the Greek influence. And this came from a pediment from a building, and you can see the Greek characters here, and it shows the influence that Alexander left behind, and also the language. So when the gospel came, and it was in the Koine Greek, it had been permeated throughout the ancient world by that time. I want to show you here. This tells us a couple of things. This is a Roman wax tablet. It shows us, first of all, how expensive paper was. And so it was very scarce, it was very expensive, and when people wrote, they used every bit of the paper. And they also wrote on pottery shards for little notes. But the Romans developed this beeswax tablets like this. They had either metal stylus or wooden stylus where they could write, if they had to just write a note or something like that, and then they could melt it down and reuse it over and over and over.
Does it close?
And they
Oh,
do
look at
close.
that. Wow. So did the libraries like in Ephesus have some of this?
The libraries preserve their things on parchments.
Okay.
And
All right.
so they may have had a few of these, but I don't think any have survived if they did. I want to show you now this Roman tent. And one of these was found in a bog in Europe, and it was intact. So some historians wanted to remake one, and they found it took 77 goat hides to make one. And it took 750 man-hours, and it weighed 88 pounds. And 8 Roman soldiers would be assigned to a tent like this, but only 4 at a time would actually sleep in it, so they were always on a rotating schedule. But what makes me like about the tent is it's not what I thought the style that Paul would have made. I guess I figured it'd be linen or something like that, but probably most of the tents, I believe, were goat hide. And this is good indication. We see these also in reliefs. Trajan's column in Rome has the events of the campaign, and we see the tents like these on that column, which is very, very interesting for me. And then this is a replica of a Roman comb, and this was one discovered almost intact at the Dead Sea when the Romans fought it.
Is it real?
This one's not real.
That's okay.
The real ones, usually the teeth are rotted away, but the one they discovered at Masada was almost intact.
So it's a high fidelity replica.
Yes. But they made small combs about this size with very fine teeth for combing out lice. And so that was a real problem in the ancient world. Then this is one of Herod's structures that he built over the cave of the patriarchs, where Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and the 12 patriarchs are buried in Jerusalem. It's in Hebron, and it didn't suffer any damage. It's still intact today. It's the only Herodian structure that is intact. This was actually used as a bank, and these are mosques that were put up by the Muslims, and then a synagogue on the top. And they're very strict about whether or not you can take photos there, and even though you may have permits to go, they can always change their mind at the last minute. So that's still there today. Okay, this costume was used in the 2016 Ben-Hur movie. This costume was worn by the pilot character in the movie, but also the charioteers wore something very similar to this when they drove the chariots. Something like this would have been worn under the segmented armor that the legionnaires wore, and to protect their skin. And so these were pretty common in that time period. I want to show you the Roman footwear, the Roman boot, or the Caligulae. Caligula is named for these because it means little boots, and the soldiers made him a pair because his father was a general and he would come on some of the campaigns, and he hated the name. These are made from one piece of leather laid out flat, and 2 boards then would be put over this and then tacked together. The tack heads acted as cleats, and as they marched upon the Roman roads, these would sometimes spark, I read, and then also the sound of this, the army marching and coming towards the enemy, would be very intimidating to them. These provided comfort, and they didn't cause blisters. Therefore, they didn't get foot infections. And so that was an amazing thing. The traction that they had on the dirt gave them extra advantage in a battle, because the battles are fought in close and pushing and all that kind of maneuvering, trying to stab your enemy. So that's what these are. Okay, this is our Roman crucifixion display. And until 1968, no crucified victim had been discovered because the Romans left them on the crosses to rot. In 1968, they were building a parking lot in Jerusalem, and they bumped into a grave, or a place where they had the ossuaries, the bone boxes, and they discovered someone that had been crucified, and the nail went through the heel bone and was still intact. It must have hit a knot in the olive wood tree that it went into. They found that it had an olive wood plank on the outside of the heel, but it blew everybody's minds because they just never thought of that. Our image is the feet like this with a nail going through the top, but that came from the Renaissance painters. They had never seen a crucifixion. The Romans didn't write down how they attached them to the crosses. And so they discovered that this individual straddled the cross. Even though they had the one heel bone, they were able to conclude that. They thought that might have just been an isolated case, But in 2018, they found 2 more heel bones, one in Britain, one in Italy, and they have holes in the heels where the nails went through exactly the same fashion as this. So we have to rethink our crucifixion, and it went through the heel bones, they straddled the cross, and we know in Judea they used olive wood crosses. A whole olive wood cross would weigh, out of olive wood, 300 pounds. So we read, though, in the writings, they only carried the cross beam to the place of the crucifixion. The uprights were in place. Olive trees aren't that tall, nor do they have to be. And so your crucified victims are probably at nearly eye level with these soldiers that put them on the cross. And so the cross would not have been a very odorous place to be. It would have been a lot of bad odors coming from there because of the body functions. These are nails that were discovered in Scotland. These are Roman nails. It was known that this unit got recalled back to Rome, but all Roman legions made the same size everything. And so every nail, everything that they made, every unit, wherever they were in the empire, when they came together, had all the same equipment. The Romans liked everybody to do everything the same way. I'm gonna step over here, and I want to show you a Roman scourge whip. And there's a lot of confusion about Roman scourge whips. They were not cats of 9 tails. The Roman military scourge whip used bronze barbs, very standardized. And there were weights that went down, and these barbs would slide up and down this. And the word scourge in Latin means to flay skin, like flaying a fish. You would have the one that held the whip, you had the victim, and you had an interrogator. Scourging was a process of getting the truth for the Romans, and they felt no one could continue under scourging for any length of time without breaking down and telling the truth. In here, I have an actual scourge barb that dates back to the 1st or 2nd century. And you can see the barbs here, and it would slide up and down. There was another one that came up at auction that had double row, and they were offset.
So that's real. How old is it?
First century AD to 1st century or 2nd century AD. And so those come up at auction rarely, so you have to be diligent to find those. Then Roman dice are pretty common. They're pretty easy to find at auction. They're made from bone on most occasions that you find them, but they look just like, it looks like it came from a Monopoly game, an antique Monopoly game. And again, 1st century AD to 2nd century AD, this particular dice. Now, I want to talk about why a sponge was at the cross. And Romans used sponges for one thing. They were toilet paper. And so a Roman public toilet would have had these in buckets of vinegar. You would use it through the funny little hole of the toilet in the front, and then you would rinse it in the clear stream running by, and you leave it in the bucket of vinegar for the next person. But Roman soldiers carried theirs in their packs, and so it would have been at the cross. If you look it up in the Strong's, the Greek there, the ozos, wine that they pour on the sponge or the vinegar, it's a bitter wine. And it's what the Roman soldiers carried on the march so they could tolerate any taste to stay hydrated. And so it was a very bitter. They weren't trying to be nice. They were trying to be kind. This was capital punishment. And the victim was expected to die a cruel death, and that's what they were doing. Okay, so we're going to look at a few of these models and dioramas that we've got here. This is a small model we have of the Sea of Galilee boat that was discovered in 1986. It was discovered when the Sea of Galilee got at a very low level. And the one that they found dates to either between 150 BCE to probably 50 AD, somewhere in that range. And what they discovered is it had 4 oars that came down, so you needed 4 oarsmen and you needed a helmsman to guide it. So it required 5 individuals to man the boat, but it could hold up to 14 individuals. However, they don't have a keel that goes down at the water, so when the wind blows them, they're like a canoe and they tilt over. So in high wind with a lot of waves, these could be rather treacherous little vessels to be in. The type of netting that would have been used in this type of vessel is called a seine net or a drag net, and that would be strung out behind the vessel. And one person would strip and be down in the water to bring out that line, and the corks would go along the top to help it float. The casting net was only used on the shore, so the seine net the ship would go out in an arc and then come back towards the shore, and then they would pull that in with the catch of the fish. Over here we have an oil press, a Gethsemane, and there are a couple different types of presses, and this is one particular style. And this would have been the second phase in pressing olives. The first phase is you just take the olives and you put them in warm water and the oil separates, and that's your best oil. This is like the second process, and you get more oil out of this way. And then there's like sort of a fulcrum style that gets the remainder of the oil out of the skin, and that's the most crude of the oils. And so Jesus prayed in the garden of the oil press, or Gethsemane. And wine press, or vineyard here, this style, the Romans and the Greeks and all the ancients, they knew how to grow grapes, they knew how to put them on trellises, and also in Judea. So they didn't grow on the ground. I've heard talk of people saying that they let them grow on the ground and then raised them up, and that's just not the case. Here we've got 2 models. This is an enlargement of this area. This is the Temple Mount here, and Herod rebuilt the temple, Ezra's temple, at a grand scale. And what's interesting is this area here is all you have underneath section of this base, the Temple Mount. And you have barrel vaulted ceilings under there. And the same type of construction is seen in Caesarea, where he builds the temple to Augustus Caesar. Here you have the Fortress Antonia. There is some discussions whether or not it was or wasn't here, but it's believed to be adjacent. Antonia, it's in honor of Mark Antony, and that's why it got its name. The soldiers come over to rescue Paul. And if you see, there's like a little fenced area around here, that's called the balustrade. And 2 balustrade warnings have been discovered on the Temple Mount, warning foreigners not to go beyond that fence, otherwise death could ensue. Now here is a 1st century model of Jerusalem, and 99% of what we know about Jerusalem in the 1st century comes from the writings of Josephus. The Romans, when they destroyed it in 70 AD, the Latin word rado, R-A-D-O, scraped it off the map. And so here you have the old city of David here in this section. You have the Pool of Siloam. The Gihon Spring is over here. This circus, this chariot race, is not probably correct in this model. It probably did not exist inside the city walls. If it existed, it probably was over in this area. These red roof buildings are indicative of Roman-styled villas. And then up here you have Herod's palace, a grand palace. Josephus wrote that the stones he had imported in were so white, it was brilliant white inside there. There are gardens and little streams. There are 3 towers he builds. And this is more of a fortress than anything. Herod's palace, he had 3 towers named for one person he murdered, his wife, Mariana, and Hickus and Faisal. And these were people that he knew. One was his brother. The Romans left one of those towers, which today is called the Tower of David. The base of that structure today is the original Herodian structure. The Crusaders rebuilt the top part of this. The Romans left this standing, and the Wailing Wall at the Temple Mount as a statement of what they would do to those who fought against Rome. The Pool of Bethsaida, the 5-port pool, is right in this area, and it's been discovered recently that it was a place of pagan worship in the 1st century, And so that's worth noting. Here you've got the Mount of Olives in this area. And then this is the lower to middle section of Jerusalem in the first century here. And these houses go up, and there's a model here that we have, and we have a photograph on the back there, and that is a photo of the model in Jerusalem, of Jerusalem, and it's at least an acre big. And we've just put 3D printed houses here to try to give a feel, a diorama of that. Some of the homes here that we have domes on them, and I get a lot of questions about that, but on the model here, there is a house over there that has a dome. But these made it cooler inside the dwelling. Now, whether or not they had them in Jerusalem, I don't know, but these styles houses do exist in the Middle East. Rick Dees went to Haran in Turkey, and they have a very sharp pointed roofs there, and one of his episodes just discussing how much cooler it was inside the dwelling because of the rise, the hot air went upwards. And so he commented on that design. And this over here is a Roman mile marker. And Roman mile markers, there was really no exact rhyme or reason how they spaced them, but where they had them, the distance it marked was the distance to Rome. And so wherever you were, it told you how far it was from Jerusalem to Rome, and that was it. So that all roads lead to Rome. So that was the idea there. So here we're going to talk about a Roman legionnaire. This cloak on this model was used in the original Ben-Hur movie in the 50s with Charlton Heston. But the other pieces are made mostly in India. There's a cottage industry there that supports reenactors, especially in Britain, that like to do reenactments of this. And I want to show you, this armor is segmented. Lorica, that's what that means. Segmented armor, lorica, so segmented armor. The Roman helmet, it had earpieces on the sides. There's protection in the back. These protected from blows. These protected you on the sides, but you could hear the instructions given in battle there with the ear openings. You had a sword. This is a gladius sword. This is the Iron Age, so iron can break, can get dull. So the sword is designed as a stabbing weapon, and in conjunction with the shield, and this shield is a little smaller than the actual shield, but the shields are made from wood, covered with leather, and before battle they would soak the leather so that the flaming arrows would be quenched on impact. This is called a shield boss. Your hand goes up inside there. And then many of these that are found, the soldiers etched the gods they worshipped on these, which is interesting. And so your gladius sword is designed as a stabbing weapon. And it would stay sharp this way if used in this manner. But if you went up whacking away with this, it would get dull. And so Roman soldiers in training, if they handled their swords improperly, they would be fined, and their ration would be cut. They would be cut from wheat to barley rations, I've read. And one Roman writer that saw a battle said that anyone that was stabbed with one of these in their torso area, they bled to death, as he observed. There are quite many stories about Roman legionnaires in battle. The better the general, the more loyal the soldiers were to them. This is a pilum. That's a spear. They take two of these into battle typically, one for close combat and one to throw. These are designed to be thrown one time, and they bend on impact, and they find them all over Europe that are bent. And somehow they blended this with iron and lead so it would bend. If you threw it and you missed your target, they couldn't throw it back at you. So that was one good reason. If it hit the shield of the enemy, it would bend in the shield, and they couldn't pull it out, so their shield was useless. And so that was another reason. And then if it penetrated armor and bent, the person was pretty much a casualty at that point. One at the cross, remember, the cross doesn't have to be that tall. And olive wood crosses aren't that tall, so the spear probably punched upward at an angle like that, I would give my opinion about that. And that's about what we have here. The Roman soldiers on average were 150 pounds, about 5 foot 6 inches, and their gear could weigh upwards close to 80 to 100 pounds that they had to march with.